If you want to find out what the 3 world premiere cards effects potentially are for the 2019 Megatins, along with what the reprints could entail, you will 100% want to watch until the end of this video to find out. To start, I'm going to read what the info says about these 3 world premiere cards. One of 3 new world premiere cards designed to be usable in any deck, and help you stage a comeback against some of the fastest strategies that might come from your opponent. One card prevents graveyard dumping, another punishes your opponent if they summon too many monsters, and the third gives you a reprieve if they set up a monstrously large field on their first turn. So this was the info we received about these 3 world premiere cards coming out in the 2019 Megatins, and with that information we can decipher a few things just about all of the cards in general. First off, it said all cards are meant to stage a comeback against some of the fastest strategies in the game. So by fastest strategies, what does this actually mean? Well, all of these could be potential counters to combo decks, because obviously as of recent, combo decks have been becoming so much more powerful than ever before. I mean, we have, for example, Dark Warrior, Goki, just any warrior variant from last year. We had Pendulum FTK, Danger FTK, all of the FTKs from last year. We also have right now Danger Thunder Dragon, which is running rampant as the best combo deck in the format. We have Endymion coming up to be one of the best combo decks in the format. So there are quite a lot of powerful combo decks just in general in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And so with that, I guess Konami is trying to have a set of 3 new cards to counter these super powerful combo strategies. There are obviously already counters, but maybe these cards are just so much better for countering them. Obviously, control decks aren't necessarily out of the equation either. I mean, there's obviously the 2 best decks, which are Sky Striker and Salamangreat, and then you have Danger Thunder Dragon, which is the 3rd best deck, and that's the combo deck. But regardless, it doesn't change the fact that you definitely want some counters to Danger Thunder Dragon and any combo deck like it. So are all of these meant to counter combo decks? Most likely, and that's what I'm going to assume, although the first card may be a bit different. So it doesn't necessarily mean it can't counter control decks either, however, because of the fact that obviously these cards are just generic cards. They may have purposes against control decks in the future. And remember, by fastest, it could also mean the fastest control decks. It just says the fastest strategies, not necessarily implying control or combo. However, in the end, I would say it's more likely combo, just because those are the nature of faster strategies. And secondly, it's saying it will stage a comeback. So it's interesting because the first card definitely doesn't sound like it will stage a comeback, and instead will prevent something, which entitles a hand trap. However, besides that, it says stage a comeback, which means it doesn't necessarily imply that they're all hand traps. And it could be something similar to something like Evenly Matched, or it could be something similar to like Raw Sphere Mode, etc. So now, what do these new cards entail? Well, the first card we're going to talk about prevents graveyard dumping. That's the main tagline with this first card. And so because it says prevents, I would assume this is a hand trap or some sort of card that can prevent graveyard dumping when going second. I would say that arguably it could even be a new hand trap card. Instead of something like a new monster, maybe we get a trap card that can be activated while you control no cards, like Infinite Impermanence. However, I'm going to more likely say it's a hand trap since it states prevent, and it's more likely the nature of a monster hand trap to have an effect like that. So my argument is I would say it could be similar to Artifact Lancia. So obviously Artifact Lancia prevents banishing in general. Neither player can banish cards the turn this card was used. So that means that if we were to apply that to this card and instead we said graveyard, like no cards can be sent to the graveyard, then honestly that would be really broken. I mean, think about it. If any card can't be sent to the graveyard, then that means you can't activate spells and traps, and you can't link summon or synchro summon, etc. It would basically be Cold Wave level, but way more broken and on an entirely different level. So one thing that needs to be clear is there should be a distinct difference between any card being sent to the graveyard and something like preventing effects from sending to the graveyard. What do I mean by that? Well, this needs to prevent effects specifically that send to the graveyard. So stuff like Foolish Burial, Gazelle, Hayate, etc. Stuff like Charge of the Light Brigade, etc. Stuff like that needs to be prevented from this card. I don't agree with the idea that, oh, any card can't be sent to the graveyard, because obviously then that would create literally probably the best card ever printed, because that just sounds so degenerate. But at the same time, this effect is implying that it will be something like it will prevent effects that send to the graveyard. It will most likely be a continuous effect as well, because if it was a singular use effect like Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, then speaking of Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, why would I ever play it over Ash Blossom, which does the exact same thing but is more multi-purpose, because Ash Blossom already states that it can negate the effects that send to cards to the graveyard. So what this needs to do to be different from Ash Blossom is it needs to prevent that for the entire turn, a continuous effect basically. So for the second card, I'm gonna make the argument that, well, first off, it sounds a lot like Max C. Well, I mean, obviously we all know what Max C does. Anytime your opponent special summons, you draw one. The card is now banned for a reason, but basically it punishes the opponent for too many summons. That's what the second card will do. And obviously it's pretty direct, something that happens each time your opponent summons something. But there are a few things we can learn from this. First off, it never necessarily specified how bad the scale of this card is, so it might not even be necessarily as powerful or more powerful than Maxi. It could be a lot worse. It could be very similar to Null Nun and Blooming Dogwood, a card that we're getting in the upcoming Yu-Gi-Oh set Dark Neostorm, which is another hand trap similar to Maxi, but it gains a life point. So maybe instead of gaining life points for yourself, it will inflict damage to your opponent each time your opponent summons something, which actually could be really wild, because if your opponent summons too many monsters with a lot of attack points, then, well, they are just going to lose because they get burnt to 0. This also is a big deal for decks like Chain Burn, etc. Just any burn decks that rely on something like inflicting damage to your opponent in order to win the duel. Ignoring that, however, there are other potential results that could come about from this card. For example, draw X cards after X summons doesn't necessarily mean each summon, so it may be directly worse than Maxi, but another form of it. So maybe, for example, if your opponent summons 3 monsters, you draw 1 card, something like that, which isn't necessarily at the same scale as Maxi, but it's definitely something similar. After X summons end their turn, so maybe like if your opponent summons 5 monsters in 1 turn, then their turn ends, and you can just activate this after they commit to the 5 summons. While this card isn't necessarily as good against some decks, like for example, it's not nearly as good against Sky Striker, because obviously they're only summoning like 2 to 3 times per turn, but at the same time, it completely shuts down combo decks entirely because they can't summon anything from that point onwards. Another thing to note about that effect, however, is it doesn't even necessarily mean end the duel. If your opponent's playing a control deck and they can't OTK you, then you still have another turn to play. You can just set up maybe like 1 negate and it becomes a much slower game, and it gives the control deck a chance to, well, obviously the following turn the opponent can apply more pressure. That doesn't necessarily mean that it just outright ends the duel if you resolve this card, and it gives the control player a better chance of playing after turn 1, or it's maybe a combo deck mirror match, and then from there you have each player having separate turns. It may be a side deck staple, etc. But I think this card definitely has a lot of potential to be really good. It could even be something like Ghost Ogre, except it sends 1 to 2 cards instead. So it doesn't necessarily need to be like all cards the opponent controls, but it could just be 1 card. Maybe, for example, after your opponent summons 3 monsters, send 2 cards your opponent controls to the graveyard, something like that. And maybe it's your opponent's choice, for example. So I don't necessarily think that this card needs to be broken, but like anything like these effects or other effects as well have the potential being used for this card. So the third card is weird because the way it's worded doesn't sound like a hand trap. The other 2 cards could definitely be hand traps, and I made arguments for them being hand traps. However, the third card, I'm gonna argue something different because the text implies that it won't be a hand trap. It says manage a comeback after your opponent sets up a full board. So which means this is probably going to be similar to Super Poly, Sphere Mode, and Slash, or Evenly Matched. What do I mean by this? Well, first off, maybe the card can't be responded to. Maybe it's a normal spell, but the most important thing is it can't be responded to. If it can't be responded to, then it means it's immune to negates, which is obviously a big deal. And maybe it's something similar to Super Poly Slash Sphere Mode. Maybe if they control 3 monsters, you can send 2 of them to the graveyard. One interesting thing that these these cards could entail is maybe not you being able to choose what cards get sent, but the opponent chooses what cards get sent, which I think could create an interesting dynamic as well, which means this card won't necessarily be as good against something like True Draco if they still add Masterpiece, because obviously at that point they're not going to set up a field full of negates, but at the same time you can choose what cards they will keep, and so something like this against Extra Links will be a big deal because then it sends everything but one monster, so you better pray you have something that is actually really good by itself rather than being co-linked. I think another thing could be your opponent needs to control more than or equal to X number of monsters, so if they control 3 monsters, maybe that's the right amount, and then they send however many to the graveyard. There are ways to play around it because you can just control 2 monsters, and that completely plays around it, but it doesn't mean it's, again, good against every deck. I think it's really cool what this card could have as its dynamic, being specifically good against control decks and being really good against combo decks that set up a massive field and just being the best card against them. So yeah, I think it will send, because if it were to destroy, then there will be a lot of ways to play around it, with Colossus, for example, being completely immune to it. But I also think another interesting effect besides just sending is actually negating all monster effects your opponent controls. So maybe it's not as good against Extra Links, which I mean aren't really prevalent without Firewall as of now, but at the same time this could entail a way to manage to break your opponent's board. Maybe you just can't break your opponent's board, but you have the potential of being able to. I think if it was something like this, it would be a normal spell, and again, it cannot be responded to. I think any spell that has this type of effect cannot be responded to, or else you're basically not going to be able to well resolve it because so many decks will set up negates. And there are already cards like Evenly Match which could potentially do something better than this spell, and that could be a potential possibility that obviously Evenly Match may just be better than whatever card this is. So that's what I think the potential of these 3 current world premiere cards could potentially be, and obviously they could be something completely different, but as of right now that's my thoughts on that. But before you go, let's talk about the reprints in this set as well. There's the potential of good reprints overall, and just I'll give you guys some potential ideas as to what these reprints are. So for example, Dangerous Tsukinoko confirmed. Does that mean all dangers in the Megatins? I would argue that yes, this could be the case. There are different rarities for cards as well, which I think this is a big deal because we can get more than X amount of secret rares in one slot, more than X amount of ultra rares in one slot, etc. If there were only 15 secret rare slots before, we could have as much as all of them if Konami decided that. We have so many cool rarity bumps as well because of this new rule. For example, Pankratops will most likely get rarity bumped. We already know Nightmare Mermaid and Kalwai will get reprints and probably rarity bumped as well. So there's just a lot of cool potential with these rarity bumps, not to mention the already all good reprints that could happen, like Colossus, Boral Sword, which already is getting reprinted in Hero's Revenge, but could get another reprint in here, and then a reprint in the structure deck, Revolver. We have Cyber Dragons, Borreload Savage Dragon, Extravagance and Phantasme, etc. And all of these are potential candidates for rarity bumps / reprints in general, which I think is actually a really big deal. And so with that in mind, I have high hopes for the 2019 Megatins. Whether it be the reprints or these 3 new world premiere cards, I 100% feel this will be a great set overall for the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Before you go, make sure you guys subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to watch more videos like this one. With that, I'll see you guys soon.